This section of the Bone Tissue and Skeletal System chapter is going to focus on the structure of bones and the tissues that make them up as organs of the skeletal system. As I discussed with the integumentary system, an important aspect of thinking of organ systems is how the organs are made up of different types of tissues. And so we want to look at the bone as an organ and all the different tissues that make it up. We're going to look at the long bone as an example of a bone as an organ and structure. The other types of bones are similar to part of this, but this covers all of the different aspects of bone. Part of what defines a long bone as a type of bone is its structure. It has a long cylindrical shaft and then flaring heads at either end. That shaft is referred to as the diaphysis, and the heads are both referred to as epiphyses. Now, a long bone most often is found in the appendages, the arms and legs, and so it's oriented with one of those flaring heads at the proximal end of the bone and the other one at the distal end of the bone. So we refer to the two epiphyses as the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis. In terms of the femur, which this bone is, the proximal epiphysis is at the hip joint and the distal epiphysis is at the knee joint. Now, for the few long bones that are found in other parts of the skeleton, the epiphyses can be referred to by a different term. Between the diaphysis and the epiphysis is a region called the metaphysis, and that's not always referred to as we're talking about the structure of long bones. But what's important is that's where the growth of long bones takes place. We'll talk about the growth plate later on, and that's at the metaphysis. Now we can see in the metaphysis a region called the epiphyseal line, a little dense line going across what's mostly spongy bone, and that's the calcified remains of the growth plate. The diaphysis is a hollow cylinder, and it's filled with bone marrow, namely yellow bone marrow, which is really adipose tissue. And then the epiphyses are mostly spongy bone with just a thin outer shell of compact bone, giving them a smooth surface. And they're usually filled with red bone marrow. In the adult, red bone marrow is really only localized to a certain number of places. So some long bones will just have yellow bone marrow throughout all of its space. The other types of bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones, essentially just have the structure that we see in the epiphyses of one of these. They're spongy bone with a thin outer shell of compact bone, giving them a smooth outer surface. Bones are composed of living tissues, so it's very important that they have a blood supply. This picture shows the major blood vessels that come in. Now, the primary entry of blood vessels into the bone is at a region called the nutrient foramen, and the nutrient artery and vein pass through this hole. There's also arteries and veins getting into the bone at other locations, but the nutrient vessels are the main ones going into it. There's also going to be nerve fibers as well as lymphatic vessels going in to the bone. And all of these structures go in through this nutrient foramen, and especially the blood vessels are going to fill in a lot of the medullary cavity where they can interact with the bone marrow and send smaller and smaller vessels into the tissue here and there. There are four major types of cells associated with bone and bone tissue. The osteogenic cell is the primary stem cell that gives rise to most of the other bone cells. Osteoblasts are, as far as their name is concerned, still a type of stem cell, but they have an important role to play, which is forming the bone matrix, the extracellular space that is the tissue. And the osteoblasts will eventually become osteocytes. The osteogenic cell, the osteoblast, and the osteocyte represent really a family tree of cells. One becomes the next, becomes the last. As osteoblasts form bone matrix, the osteocytes are really the cells that are kind of left behind within that space, and they help to maintain the bone matrix. And the last type of bone cell are the osteoclasts, which are responsible for resorbing bone or breaking down the bone matrix and releasing the calcium back into the bloodstream. Now you can notice from these pictures that the osteoclast has multiple nuclei. The others all have single nuclei. Osteoclasts are different from the rest. They come from a very different source. They're not made from the stem cell, the osteogenic cell, but rather they're made essentially from white blood cells. And so white blood cells of a certain type merge together to make osteoclasts. The multiple nuclei that we see are really just evidence of what used to be individual cells that have all merged together. The same cellular processes that make white blood cells able to engulf and ingest foreign material and cellular debris is also what makes it possible for the osteoclasts to break down the bone matrix. So they're actually a related type of cell. This picture, along with the previous one, show where those cells are found within the bone tissue in a bone. The osteoblasts and osteoclasts, as well as the osteogenic cells, are found along the edge of the bone tissue, on the inside spaces within the spongy bone or the inside surface of the compact bone wall of the diaphysis. We call that layer of cells the endosteum. And then on the outer surface of this bone, there's a layer of tissue called the periosteum, which is partly osteoblasts and osteogenic cells, but also there's a fibrous layer, dense irregular connective tissue, that surrounds the entire bone. Osteocytes are found within the cell, worked in between layers of bone matrix, with little gaps in the bone matrix where they're found. Those gaps are called lacunae. Lacuna is the singular of that word. Really what it is that the bone matrix is formed around the cell. So the lacuna is just the gap where that cell is. If you were painting the floor of a room, for instance, and you painted yourself into the corner, the space where you're standing that you painted up to would be like a lacuna for you. There are two types of bone tissue, both of which are found within bones, the organs. There's compact bone tissue and spongy bone tissue. Now they both have a certain level of organization to them, but the compact bone tissue is much more organized. Compact bone tissue is a solid piece of bone because it's composed of layers and layers of bone matrix. And those layers, or lamellae, are highly organized. The main structure that makes up compact bone organization is what's called the osteon. It has a central canal that's empty as far as bone tissue is concerned, but it has a blood vessel or nerve or lymphatic vessels going through it. Then surrounding that central canal are layers and layers of bone matrix called concentric lamellae. Now, there are osteocytes in between those layers of bone matrix helping to maintain them over the life of the bone. Then we have circumferential lamellae running around the outside surface of the whole bone, making it essentially a smooth surface. But filling in the spaces between those circumferential and concentric lamellae are regions of solid bone matrix still organized in layers called interstitial lamellae. There are canals coming in from the outside, perforating through the bone tissue that connect the central canals so that blood vessels can get into the tissue and connect it all together. And following those same pathways are going to be nerve fibers and lymphatic vessels. Spongy bone tissue is organized into lamellae as well, just not quite as tightly organized in compact bone tissue. There are osteoblasts and osteocytes on the outside. Again, that's the endosteum of the bone. And then osteocytes and lacunae between the layers of bone matrix. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. The osteoclasts are the ones that resorb the bone, break it apart and release the calcium back into the bloodstream. Remember, they are different from the other types. They are a descendant of white blood cells, you could say.